There are people who move through the world with a gentle stillness. They laugh at the right moments, respond politely, keep conversations light. To most, they seem perfectly fine, calm, composed, intact. But loneliness has its own way of settling into the quiet corners of a person's life. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it hides behind steady voices, soft smiles, and a practiced sense of composure that prevents anyone from looking too closely. These are the people who carry their loneliness quietly. Not because they want to, but because they've learned, slowly, often painfully, that speaking it aloud rarely changes anything. So instead, they fold it inward. Carefully. Elegantly. Until it becomes part of how they breathe, move, and exist. This is the psychology of that quiet weight, and the human stories behind it. Chapter 1: The hidden weight. Loneliness rarely arrives suddenly. For many people, it slips in quietly, through moments that appear harmless at first. A conversation that doesn't land. A shared space that feels oddly distant. A smile that doesn't reach the eyes anymore. Over time, these small emotional absences begin to add up. They gather in the pauses between messages, in the soft fatigue that follows social gatherings, in the quiet relief that comes when plans are cancelled. It becomes easier to stay silent than to explain the emptiness that shadows the day. People who carry their loneliness quietly often learn to function with remarkable grace. They show up, stay reliable, speak kindly. They blend in because blending in feels safer than revealing a need that might be misunderstood. They master the art of seeming fine even when something inside them is slowly dimming. There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't isolate physically, it isolates internally. A person may sit among friends, surrounded by laughter, yet feel an invisible distance pulling them away from the moment. It's not dramatic. It's not disruptive. It's simply a quiet awareness that something within them remains untouched, unrecognized. At first, they may brush it aside. They tell themselves it's just a phase, a mood, a temporary disconnection. But the feeling returns. Not louder, just more persistent. It settles into their routines, their thoughts, the spaces between their words. And then comes the quiet recognition. The moment they realize that loneliness has become familiar. Not an intruder, but a companion they've learned to carry without making a sound. For them, loneliness is not a dramatic collapse. It is a soft, hidden weight held carefully, privately, and with a strength no one ever sees. Chapter 2: Where the silence begins. Quiet loneliness often traces its roots back to places a person no longer remembers clearly. Not events, but atmospheres. Not single moments, but emotional climates that shaped how they learned to exist in the world. For many, the silence begins in childhood, not through loud neglect, but through subtle emotional misunderstandings. Perhaps they grew up in homes where feelings were acknowledged only when they were convenient. Where sadness felt like a burden. Where asking for comfort meant risking rejection, irritation, or dismissal. Slowly, they learned that expressing a need might disrupt the fragile balance around them. So they adapted. They became the child who didn't want to trouble anyone. The child who suppressed questions, softened disappointments, and quieted insecurities. Their silence was not a flaw, it was a solution. A way to stay safe, harmonious, unnoticed. Over time, stillness became familiar. Not just in action, but in identity. A gentle shrinking of one's emotional presence to make space for others. They learned to listen more than they spoke, to comfort others more easily than they comforted themselves, to smile even when they were unsure how to feel. As they grew older, this early conditioning shaped their adult connections. They became people who feared that vulnerability would make them too much. People who kept their inner world neatly folded, revealing only what felt easy for others to hold. People who assumed that loneliness was something to endure quietly, not something to name. What began as a child's survival strategy matured into an adult's emotional habit. They carried silence not because they lacked the desire for closeness, but because at some point they learned that silence protected them better than honesty ever did. And this is where quiet loneliness is born, not in isolation, but in adaptation. A learned softness. A learned restraint. A learned way of being that once kept them safe, but now keeps them unseen. Chapter 3: The Psychology of Quiet Loneliness. Quiet loneliness is not a simple emotion. It is a complex psychological state formed by attachment patterns, shaped by early relational experiences, and maintained by the mind's attempts to protect itself. From a psychological perspective, people who internalize loneliness often developed what researchers describe as insecure or anxious avoidant attachment. They learned early that emotional needs were unpredictable territory, sometimes met, sometimes dismissed, sometimes misunderstood. So the nervous system adapted. It learned to expect disappointment gently, quietly, almost gracefully. Instead of reaching outward, these individuals turn inward. They create an inner world where emotions feel safer held privately than exposed to the risk of misinterpretation. This is not avoidance born of indifference. It is avoidance born of fear that reaching out will only deepen the loneliness rather than ease it. Neurologically, loneliness activates the same threat pathways in the brain that physical pain does. But when someone suppresses their need for connection, the brain enters a protective loop. It lowers expectations. It numbs certain social impulses. It convinces the person that silence is the safest response, even though the body continues to crave closeness. This creates a paradox: they often appear socially capable, even warm. They communicate well, listen deeply, and make others feel understood. Yet internally, they feel detached, watching themselves interact from a distance, never fully stepping into the emotional presence they offer to others. Psychologists sometimes refer to this experience as masked loneliness. A state where someone functions well enough that their pain remains invisible, both to others and to themselves. They may not even use the word lonely. Instead, they describe feeling off, numb, unseen, or deeply tired. Underneath these words is the same truth: their loneliness is not loud because their fear of being misunderstood is louder. Quiet loneliness, then, is not the absence of connection. It is the absence of emotional permission to need, to feel, to be held without shame. Chapter 4: The Inner Conflict. Inside a person who carries their loneliness quietly, there is a tension that rarely shows on the surface. A quiet tug-of-war between two deep human impulses, the longing to be seen and the instinct to stay hidden. They want closeness. Not the superficial kind, but the gentle, sincere kind where someone understands the unspoken parts of them. Yet the moment connection begins to feel real, something inside them tightens. A subtle fear rises, a fear that exposure will lead to disappointment, misreading, or emotional imbalance. So they hold back. They give parts of themselves, but never too much. They open doors, but only halfway. Even when they trust someone, there is always a quiet monitoring inside them, a soft resistance that whispers, "Be careful. Don't lean too far." This inner conflict becomes especially strong in moments of vulnerability. A simple question, "Are you okay?" can stir an entire emotional storm. Because the honest answer feels too heavy to offer, and the practiced answer feels too empty to speak. So they say something safe. Something light. Something that keeps the world from getting too close. They may crave reassurance, yet feel undeserving of it. They may want to ask for help, yet feel guilty imagining someone carrying even a fraction of their burden. Their silence is not pride, it is protection. A self-imposed boundary meant to shield them from the possibility of being dismissed or misunderstood once again. In relationships, this conflict creates subtle patterns. They may retreat when they feel overwhelmed. Withdraw when they feel cared for. Distance themselves precisely when someone else tries to come closer. The struggle is not between loving others and avoiding them. It is between wanting to be known and fearing what happens if they truly are. Quiet loneliness often thrives in this space, between desire and fear, hope and hesitation, where someone holds their heart with both hands, unsure whether to open them or keep them closed. Chapter 5: A Moment of Realization. There comes a moment, often small, subtle, and entirely unplanned, when a person carrying quiet loneliness finally sees the weight they've been holding. It rarely arrives through a dramatic event. Instead, it appears in ordinary moments, when life is still enough for truth to surface. Maybe it happens during a conversation where they suddenly notice how carefully they choose their words. Or while sitting with someone they care about, realizing they feel both close and painfully far at the same time. Sometimes it emerges late at night, in the soft hours when distractions fade and the mind reveals what the heart has been whispering all along. The realization is rarely loud. It's a softness. A slow, inward acknowledgement, I've been lonely for a long time. In that moment, they see the years of quiet self-containment. The emotional spaces they've tiptoed around. The connections they kept at arm's length, not because they lacked desire, but because they feared what reaching out might awaken. This awareness doesn't bring immediate relief. If anything, it brings clarity mixed with grief. They notice how often they've minimized their needs, how many times they've silenced truths that deserved a voice. They see how loneliness has shaped their choices, subtly guiding who they open up to, how they ask for comfort, and how much they allow themselves to receive. But within this awareness, something else begins to shift. A sense of honesty. A recognition that the silence they carry is not a fixed identity, but a habit formed long ago. A habit that once protected them, but no longer serves the person they are becoming. The turning point is not an action. It is an internal awakening. A realization that loneliness has been living inside them for too long, and that acknowledging it is the first moment of true connection they've had with themselves in years. Chapter 6: Learning to hold themselves gently. Healing from quiet loneliness does not arrive in sudden transformation. It comes softly, in moments so small they might be overlooked if one isn't paying attention. It begins when a person starts to treat their inner world with the tenderness they once reserved only for others. The first shift is often internal, an easing of self-judgment. Instead of criticizing themselves for feeling disconnected, they begin to observe the feeling with patience. They allow loneliness to exist without forcing it into silence. This alone changes something. What was once a burden becomes an experience that can be named, understood, and held with compassion. Slowly, they start noticing the places where they deny themselves connection. The instinct to say I'm fine when they're not. The urge to withdraw when someone reaches toward them. The habit of shrinking their needs to avoid the possibility of disruption. These patterns don't disappear overnight, but understanding them loosens their grip. Healing becomes less about pushing themselves outward and more about letting themselves exist fully inward. They begin offering their emotions the space they were once denied. They may find themselves sharing a small truth with someone they trust, nothing dramatic, just honest. Maybe a single sentence that feels slightly heavier than their usual replies. And when that truth is met with care instead of judgment, something quiet inside them softens. They start to realize that connection doesn't always require grand vulnerability. Sometimes it begins with simply allowing someone to sit beside them, physically or emotionally, without pretending to be more okay than they are. Over time, the loneliness they once carried as a secret begins to integrate into their story, not as a mark of weakness but as evidence of endurance. They learn that closeness can be gentle, that longing is not something to hide, and that their silence does not need to be a prison. Healing, in the end, is not a departure from loneliness, it is learning to hold themselves with the tenderness they've always deserved. Chapter 7: The soft ending. Loneliness, when carried quietly, becomes woven into the rhythm of a person's life. It shapes how they pause before speaking, how they smile with restraint, how they move gently through spaces that never fully feel like theirs. But understanding this loneliness, naming it, seeing it, softening around it, changes the way it lives inside them. There comes a point when they begin to realize that loneliness has never been proof of inadequacy. It is evidence of their longing to belong, their capacity to feel deeply, their desire for connection in a world that often rewards emotional distance. The quietest hearts are often the ones that have loved the most intensely, even if silently. As they grow into themselves, loneliness does not vanish. But it loses its sharpness. It becomes less of a shadow and more of a reminder of everything they survived while asking for so little. They begin to understand that connection is not always loud or certain. Sometimes it arrives through small gestures, someone listening without rushing, someone staying without questioning, someone noticing the subtle tremor behind a practiced smile. In this soft ending, nothing dramatic changes. The world remains imperfect, relationships remain complex, and emotions remain layered. But the person who once carried their loneliness like a secret begins to move with a quieter kind of courage. The courage to feel. To be seen in small ways. To trust moments of tenderness without waiting for them to disappear. And perhaps most importantly, they learn this truth: loneliness is not an enemy to defeat. It is a human condition to understand, a sign that the heart is still reaching, still hoping, still capable of connection. In the quietest spaces of their life, they finally realize that their loneliness was never a flaw. It was simply the echo of their own humanity, soft, persistent, and waiting to be met with gentleness.